The allure of material equality permeates political and social discourse like an inescapable melody, promising a world where the disparities that mark the human condition would be smoothed out by an act of collective will or state intervention. However, this promise, often cloaked in rhetoric of justice and compassion, clashes head-on with philosophical and economic perspectives that see in it not a realizable utopia, but a dangerous illusion, one that, in attempting to level outcomes, ends up destroying the very engines of prosperity and individual liberty. Diving into the works of Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek is not merely an academic exercise, it is to unearth an intellectual arsenal forged to dismantle, at their foundations, the logic behind egalitarian utopias. Rand, with her inflexible objectivism, and the defense of rational egoism as the supreme virtue, and Hayek, with his penetrating analysis of the spontaneous order of the market and the insurmountable limits of human knowledge for central planning, offer powerful lenses to dissect the fallacy of imposed material equality. They not only criticize socialism and its variants for their practical results, the cues, the scarcity, the tyranny, but attack their moral and epistemological premises. Why is the pursuit of equality of outcomes so persistent, despite its historical and theoretical failures? What psychological and cultural mechanisms sustain it, disguising it as a moral imperative when, for Rand and Hayek, it represents the negation of human nature itself and the necessary conditions for the flourishing of civilization? The notion of destroying socialists in 3 minutes may sound like a hyperbolic debate, but it encapsulates the potency of the synthesis between Rand's radical individualism and the Hayekian understanding of market processes, a combination that aims to expose the fundamental incoherence of sacrificing individual liberty on the altar of a forced and, ultimately, unattainable and undesirable equality. This text proposes to explore this synthesis, not as a manual of quick rhetoric, but as a deep investigation into the roots, mechanisms, and implications of this collision of worldviews, seeking to understand why the defense of individual liberty and the spontaneous order of the market continues to be such a potent, though often unpopular, antidote against the sirens of egalitarianism. The journey will lead us to question not only the policies proposed in the name of equality, but the very foundations upon which we build our notions of justice, merit, and the role of the individual in society. The historical roots of the debate. The historical roots of the debate between individualism and collectivism, liberty and forced equality, are deep, branching out over centuries of philosophical and political thought. However, the 20th century witnessed a dramatic intensification of this confrontation, driven by revolutions, world wars, and the rise of totalitarian ideologies that promised earthly paradises through the subordination of the individual to the state or the collective. It was in this melting pot of ideas and catastrophes that Ayn Rand and F.A. Hayek emerged as crucial dissident voices. Rand, a fugitive from Soviet Russia, witnessed firsthand the destruction caused by the attempt to implement the communist ideal. Her philosophy, objectivism, was born from this experience and a profound reflection on the nature of reason, value, and individual rights. For Rand, the primary unit of value and reality is the individual, and their highest moral achievement is the pursuit of their own happiness through reason and productivity. Altruism, the notion that man should live for others, was, for her, the root of all political evil, the justification for the sacrifice of the capable individual for the incapable, of the productive for the needy, culminating in collectivist tyranny. Hayek, in turn, a prominent member of the Austrian School of Economics, focused his criticism on the fatal arrogance of central planners, the belief that the human mind could aggregate and process the vast and dispersed knowledge necessary to organize society more efficiently and justly than the spontaneous order generated by the voluntary interactions of millions of individuals in the market. In works such as The Road to Serfdom, Hayek argued that the pursuit of centralized economic control, even if motivated by noble ideals such as equality, would inevitably lead to the suppression of individual liberties and political tyranny. The evolution of socialist thought, from its utopian origins to its Marxist and social democratic incarnations, has always carried at its core the primacy of the collective and the need to level material conditions, often through the coercive redistribution of wealth and state control of the means of production. Rand and Hayek, although with different emphases and arguments, Rand focusing on the morality of rational egoism and inviolable individual rights, Hayek on the epistemology of spontaneous order and the limits of knowledge, converged in identifying material egalitarianism as a fundamental threat to liberty and prosperity. Their ideas gained traction at different times, influencing conservative and libertarian movements, especially from the second half of the 20th century onwards, as a powerful counternarrative to the perceived advance of statism and collectivist thought in the West. Understanding this historical trajectory is crucial to contextualize the force of their arguments against contemporary manifestations of the egalitarian ideal, one of the most insidious mechanisms that sustain the attractiveness of material egalitarianism is its ability to disguise itself as something natural or morally obvious. This camouflage operates on multiple levels, exploiting cognitive biases, deeply rooted emotions, and skillfully constructed cultural narratives. The aversion to inequality, for example, may have evolutionary roots in small groups of hunter-gatherers, where cooperation and sharing were essential for survival. However, transposing this primitive intuition to complex, anonymous societies based on specialization and trade is, according to the Hayekian perspective, a categorical error. The market order is not an extended family or tribe. It operates according to abstract rules that allow the coordination of millions of individuals who do not know each other and do not share concrete common goals, except to pursue their own interests within a framework of just laws. The wealth generated in this system is not a fixed pie to be divided justly by a central authority, but the dynamic result of a process of discovery and value creation, where prices act as indispensable signals, guiding the allocation of resources far more efficiently than any planner could dream of. The egalitarian narrative, however, frequently ignores this complexity, appealing to a simplistic notion of distributive justice that treats wealth as if it had fallen from the sky or been produced by an undifferentiated collective effort, leaving it to the state to correct the injustices of the resulting distribution. Ayn Rand would attack this notion at its moral foundation, the idea that the need of some generates a right over the property and effort of others. For Rand, wealth is created by the mind and the productive effort of the individual. To demand that the creator hand over the fruits of their labor to those who did not create it is not justice, but expropriation, a violation of the fundamental right to property, which is, ultimately, the right to life itself and the means to sustain it. Egalitarianism disguises itself as compassion, but, in the objectivist view, it is envy and resentment that often fuel it, the inability to celebrate the success of others and the desire to level downwards, sacrificing excellence in the name of a mediocre uniformity. The very language used, gap between rich and poor, social justice, privilege, is loaded with assumptions that frame inequality as inherently problematic and unjust, obscuring the individual differences in talent, effort, risk taken, and luck, which inevitably lead to distinct outcomes in a free society. Unmasking this naturalization of egalitarianism requires exposing its fallacious moral premises, the primacy of need over merit, in Rand's view, and its epistemological failures, the ignorance about how wealth is created and how complex social order functions. In Hayek's view, it is a matter of showing that inequality of outcomes, within a system of just rules and individual liberty, is not an aberration to be corrected, but a natural and even desirable consequence of human diversity and economic dynamism. The erosion of autonomy, the incessant pursuit of material equality, especially when pursued through coercive state intervention, exerts a profoundly corrosive impact on individual and collective autonomy, although paradoxically presenting itself as a path to the liberation of the masses. Ayn Rand saw this dynamic with crystal clarity, by placing the needs, or desires, of some as a right to be guaranteed by the effort of others. The state transforms itself into an instrument of legalized spoliation. The productive individual ceases to be an end in himself, with the right to the fruits of his labor, to become a means to the ends of others, a resource to be exploited in the name of the common good, or social justice. This moral inversion undermines the very basis of self-esteem and individual motivation. Why strive, innovate, take risks, if success will be penalized and the fruits of effort compulsorily redistributed? Individual autonomy, understood as the capacity to direct one's own life according to one's own values and judgments, is directly attacked. Dependence on the state, whether to receive benefits or to comply with complex regulations, grows, while the sphere of personal decision and responsibility shrinks. Hayek complements this analysis by focusing on the unintended consequences of intervention in central planning. The attempt to equalize outcomes requires increasing control over economic life and, by extension, over all spheres of life. To redistribute wealth, the state must first define, measure, and control it. To guarantee jobs for all, or fair wages, it needs to intervene in hiring decisions, prices, production. Each step in this direction, Hayek argues in The Road to Serfdom, restricts the freedom of individual choice, where to work, what to buy, how to invest, what to produce. Autonomy is eroded not only by direct expropriation, but by the substitution of individual decisions and the spontaneous coordination of the market for bureaucratic decrees. Collectively, society also loses autonomy. The diversity of experiments and lifestyles that flourishes in freedom is replaced by the uniformity imposed by the plan. The capacity of society to adapt and innovate, which depends on individual liberty and competition in the market of ideas and goods, is stifled. The dispersed knowledge that Hayek so emphasized ceases to be used effectively, as price signals are distorted or ignored, and decisions are centralized in hands that do not possess, nor can possess, the necessary information. The paradoxical result is that the search for security and material equality through state control leads to a society that is less prosperous, less dynamic, and, fundamentally, less free. Individual autonomy is sacrificed on the altar of an illusory security and an equality that can only be achieved by leveling everyone to mediocrity or subservience. True autonomy, for Rand and Hayek, lies in the freedom to pursue one's own goals, assume responsibility for one's own choices, and interact voluntarily with others, under the aegis of laws that protect individual rights, including the right to property. Dismantling the effects of egalitarianism. Dismantling the effects of material egalitarianism and reaffirming the principles of individual liberty and spontaneous order requires multifaceted strategies that go beyond mere theoretical criticism and enter the field of moral persuasion, education, and institutional reform. The first line of attack, inspired by Rand, must be the intransigent reaffirmation of the morality of rational self-interest and individual rights as non-negotiable ethical foundations. This implies frontally challenging the altruistic ethic that permeates much of public discourse, showing that true compassion and human progress do not derive from compulsory sacrifice, but from the voluntary cooperation between free and productive individuals who pursue their own values. It is necessary to celebrate individual success as a virtue, not as a social sin, and to defend the right to property not as a privilege, but as an essential extension of the right to life and liberty, arguing that the pursuit of personal happiness, through reason and work, is the moral purpose of each individual's life, and that the only social obligation is to respect the same rights in others, creates an ethical barrier against demands for forced redistribution. The second strategy, more aligned with Hayek, focuses on education about market processes and the limits of human knowledge. It is crucial to explain patiently how wealth is created, not merely distributed, how prices function as vital signals for economic coordination, and why attempts at central planning, even well-intentioned ones, are doomed to fail and tyranny due to the knowledge problem. This involves popularizing concepts such as spontaneous order, unintended consequences, and the importance of abstract and impersonal rules, the rule of law, in contrast to the arbitrary rule of men, illustrating with historical and contemporary examples how the most economically free societies are also the most prosperous and innovative, and how attempts to impose equality have led to misery and oppression, can be a powerful tool. A generic illustrative case could be the comparison between systems that allow the free fluctuation of prices and the entry and exit of companies, even if they generate temporary inequalities, versus systems that impose price controls, subsidies, and barriers to entry in the name of justice or stability. In the first case, we see dynamism, innovation, and a general trend of rising living standards. Think of the technological revolution. In the second, we see scarcity, poor quality, black markets, and stagnation. Think of rent controls or excessively regulated sectors. The hidden dynamic to be exposed is that intervention, by distorting price signals and hindering the market discovery process, destroys the information necessary for the efficient allocation of resources, harming everyone in the long run, especially the poorest who would depend on a dynamic market to find opportunities. Finally, strategies must include the defense of institutional reforms that limit the power of the state, protect property rights, guarantee freedom of contract, and promote free competition. This can involve everything from defending constitutions that restrict the scope of government to promoting specific policies such as tax reduction, deregulation, and privatization. The goal is not to create a society without government, but a government limited to its essential function of protecting individual rights, leaving individuals free to cooperate and compete voluntarily in the pursuit of their own goals. Dismantling egalitarianism requires, therefore, a combination of moral courage, intellectual clarity, and political pragmatism. The mechanisms of egalitarianism. Deepening the analysis of the hidden mechanisms that perpetuate the attraction to material egalitarianism, we find the subtle exploitation of envy and resentment, universal human feelings that, when politicized, become potent fuels for demagoguery. The egalitarian narrative often frames wealth not as the result of value creation, but as extraction or exploitation. The success of some is presented as the direct cause of the failure or difficulty of others, fueling the perception of a zero-sum game where the gain of one necessarily implies the loss of another. This view ignores the fundamental nature of the free market economy, which is a positive-sum game, where voluntary exchanges benefit both parties and innovation creates new wealth that did not exist before. Let us think of the development of a new medicine or technology. The inventor and the investor can become enormously wealthy, but millions of people also benefit from the product, whether through improved health, productivity, or access to information. The wealth generated was not taken from anyone, it was created. However, the rhetoric that focuses on disparity and the gap obscures this creation of value, directing the focus to the difference in outcomes and insinuating injustice. Ayn Rand identified envy as the hatred of the good for being the good. It is not about the desire to possess what the other has, but the desire that the other does not have it. Egalitarianism, by promising to level the conditions, offers a moral justification for this destructive feeling, masking it as a search for justice. The mechanism operates by exploiting a cognitive flaw, the difficulty in visualizing the complex and often invisible processes of wealth creation, and the ease in focusing on the visible and tangible differences in outcomes. It is easier to point to the billionaires' mansion and clamor for redistribution than to understand the network of innovations, risks, investments, and jobs that may be associated with his fortune. The hidden dynamic is the transformation of personal envy into a political program. Politicians and ideologues realize that appealing to resentment against the rich or privileged is an effective way to mobilize support, especially in times of economic hardship or social change. The promise to take from the rich to give to the poor simplifies complex problems and offers a convenient scapegoat, diverting attention from government failures, structural problems, or individual responsibility. A generic illustrative case is the way the debate on progressive taxes is often conducted. Instead of a sober discussion about the effects of taxes on capital formation, investment, job creation, and tax collection itself, Laffer curve, the debate often descends into a moralistic battle over who pays their fair share, with the taxation of the richest being presented as a matter of pure retributive justice, regardless of the economic consequences. Envy is sanctified as zeal for equality. Dismantling this mechanism requires not only exposing the destructive nature of envy, as Rand did, but also educating about the positive-sum nature of free economies and the importance of capital and entrepreneurship for general prosperity, as emphasized by the Austrian tradition of Hayek. It requires shifting the focus from the distribution of existing wealth to the creation of new wealth and opportunities for all. Another powerful mechanism that sustains the egalitarian ideal is the denial or minimization of innate and acquired individual differences in talents, ambitions, work ethic, and willingness to take risks. The implicit, often unstated, premise behind many egalitarian proposals is that, in the absence of social injustices or privileges, outcomes would be much more uniform. The observed disparities are, therefore, attributed primarily to external and systemic factors, discrimination, exploitation, unequal luck of birth, and not to intrinsic differences between individuals. If everyone is fundamentally equal in ability and potential, or if the differences are socially constructed and, therefore, remediable by social engineering, then inequality of outcomes can only be the product of a rigged system. This view ignores the undeniable reality of human diversity. People differ enormously in intelligence, creativity, physical abilities, temperament, interests, values, and the intensity with which they pursue their goals. Some are naturally more risk-averse. Others seek challenges. Some value free time and security more. Others prioritize the accumulation of wealth or professional recognition. Some possess a rigorous work ethic. Others are less disciplined. These differences, interacting with circumstances and luck, which Hayek recognized as a real factor, but impossible to eliminate without destroying freedom, will inevitably produce a vast range of outcomes in any society that allows a minimum of individual liberty. Trying to force equality of outcomes in the face of this fundamental diversity is like trying to make all runners cross the finish line at the same time, regardless of their speed, training, or effort. It would require absurd handicaps, constant interventions, and, ultimately, the suppression of those who excel. Ayn Rand celebrated this diversity, seeing the individual mind as the source of all progress and value. The attempt to deny differences, especially in capacity and productive virtue, was, for her, a manifestation of the hatred of the good. Hayek, in turn, saw the diversity of knowledge and skills as the very basis of the complex social order. It is precisely because individuals are different and possess unique and dispersed knowledge that cooperation through the market is so productive. The central planner, by treating individuals as interchangeable parts or by trying to equalize their outcomes, ignores this vital source of information and dynamism. The hidden dynamic here is the attraction to a simplistic and morally convenient explanation for social complexity. It is more psychologically comfortable to attribute the success of others to luck or injustice, and one's own failure to external factors, than to confront the implications of individual differences and personal responsibility. The denial of differences serves as an alibi to avoid self-evaluation and justify external intervention as a solution. An illustrative case can be observed in certain educational debates, where the pursuit of equality of outcomes, leads to policies that seek to eliminate programs for talented students, inflate grades, or reduce academic rigor, all in the name of reducing performance disparities. The result is not the elevation of those who have difficulties to the level of the most capable, but often the leveling down, harming the potential of all and depriving society of the exceptional talents that could drive progress. Challenging this mechanism requires the courage to recognize and even celebrate human diversity, including differences in ability and outcomes, while insisting on equality before the law and the protection of individual liberties as the appropriate framework for each one to flourish according to their potential and effort, without imposing a single standard of success or outcome. The persistence of the egalitarian ideal also feeds on a fundamental failure to understand the nature and function of profit and private property in the market process. In the socialist narrative and in many popular criticisms of capitalism, profit is often portrayed as an undue appropriation, a surplus extracted from the labor of others or from the consumer. The private property of the means of production is seen as the tool that allows this exploitation. This view completely ignores the crucial role that profit, and the possibility of loss, plays as a guide for the allocation of scarce resources and as an incentive for innovation and efficiency. In a market economy, profit is not guaranteed. It is the result of the entrepreneur correctly anticipating the needs and desires of consumers and organizing the factors of production in such a way as to satisfy them at a lower cost than the price consumers are willing to pay. Profit is a signal that resources are being moved from less valued uses to uses more valued by society, as expressed in the purchasing choices of consumers. Loss, on the other hand, signals that resources are being wasted, that the value of the inputs is greater than the value of the final product for consumers. The profit and loss system, therefore, is an essential feedback mechanism that disciplines producers and directs capital to where it is most needed. Private property is the institution that makes this system possible. Without private property of the means of production, there is no market for capital goods. Without a market, there are no genuine prices for these goods, and without prices, rational economic calculation becomes impossible. This is the core of Ludwig von Mises' argument, Hayek's mentor, about the impossibility of economic calculation in socialism. The socialist central planner, even with the best intentions and the most powerful computers, simply has no way of knowing whether he is using resources efficiently or wasting them. Rand's critique complements this economic view with a moral perspective. Private property is not only efficient, it is just. It is the recognition of the individual's right to the fruits of his own effort and thought. To attack profit and private property is to attack the very capacity of the individual to create value and sustain his life. The hidden dynamic behind the demonization of profit and property is the inability to see the economy as a dynamic process of creation and discovery, and not as a static allocation of existing resources. It is the failure to understand that the capitalist or entrepreneur is not simply exploiting labor, but performing crucial functions, saving and investing capital, postponing his own consumption, taking risks, since profit is not guaranteed and loss is possible, innovating, finding new ways to satisfy needs, and coordinating factors of production. An illustrative case is the hostility often directed at intermediaries, speculators, or financial institutions. They are seen as parasites who profit without producing anything tangible. However, from the Hayekian economic point of view, they perform vital functions. The intermediary connects buyers and sellers, reducing transaction costs. The speculator anticipates future changes in supply and demand, helping to smooth price fluctuations and signal future scarcity. Financial institutions channel savings into productive investments, attacking their profits or trying to eliminate them through excessive regulation or direct prohibition does not eliminate the need for these functions. It only makes them more expensive, less efficient, or pushes them into informal markets, harming the economy as a whole. Dismantling this mechanism requires a robust defense not only of the efficiency, but of the morality of honestly obtained profit and private property as pillars of freedom and prosperity. It requires tirelessly explaining how these elements, far from being tools of exploitation, are indispensable for the coordination of a complex society and for the continuous improvement of human well-being. A fourth hidden mechanism, perhaps the most dangerous because of its political implications, is the epistemological arrogance that sustains the belief in the state's capacity to redesign society and equalize outcomes. Hayek called this rationalist constructivism or synoptic delusion, the illusion that human reason can fully comprehend social complexity and plan its future from the top down. The proponent of material equality imposed by the state assumes, implicitly or explicitly, that he possesses the knowledge necessary to 1. Define what constitutes a just distribution of resources, an inherently subjective and contestable concept. 2. Accurately measure the possessions and needs of millions of individuals. 3. Understand all the interconnections and long-term consequences of his redistributive interventions. And 4. Implement these interventions efficiently and impartially, without creating new forms of injustice or corruption. Hayek argued vigorously that this type of knowledge is fundamentally unattainable. The knowledge relevant to the social order is not concentrated in any single mind or committee. It is dispersed among millions of individuals, incorporated in their tacit skills, subjective preferences, and local circumstances of time and place. The market order, with its price system, is the only known mechanism capable of aggregating and using this dispersed information effectively, coordinating the actions of countless participants without the need for a central plan. The attempt to replace this spontaneous order with a deliberate plan, based on the limited and inevitably distorted knowledge of the planners, is not only inefficient, but represents a pretense of knowledge, an intellectual arrogance that ignores the fundamental limits of human reason. Rand, although focusing more on the moral dimension, also attacked this arrogance. For her, the attempt to plan the lives of others was a fundamental violation of individual autonomy and the sovereignty of each person's mind. No one has the right or the ability to dictate the values, goals, and actions of another peaceful individual. The imposition of a social plan in the name of equality was, in her view, the ultimate manifestation of the collectivist mentality that subordinates the individual to an abstract project, treating people as mere means to an end defined by the state. The hidden dynamic is the seduction of power and control that accompanies the belief in one's own intellectual and moral superiority. Those who see themselves as social engineers, capable of correcting the failures of society and leading it to an ideal state of equality, are often driven by a hubris that blinds them to the destructive consequences of their actions. They underestimate the complexity of the spontaneous order they intend to replace and overestimate their own capacity to predict and control the results. A generic illustrative case can be found in the repeated attempts to implement centralized industrial policies, where governments try to pick winners and direct investments to sectors considered strategic. Historically, such policies are replete with costly failures, misallocation of resources, regulatory capture by special interests, and corruption. The knowledge necessary to make these decisions effectively simply does not exist in a government committee. It emerges from the competitive process of trial and error in the market. The belief that bureaucrats can outperform the market in allocating capital is a classic example of the fatal arrogance described by Hayek. Combating this mechanism requires a dose of intellectual humility, a recognition of the limits of our knowledge, and an appreciation for the wisdom embedded in the institutions and processes that have evolved spontaneously over time, such as the market, private property, and the rule of law. It requires advocating for a more modest and decentralized approach to solving social problems, based on individual liberty, experimentation, and continuous adaptation, rather than grand utopian plans imposed from above. This raises a dangerous question: to what extent is the very pursuit of centralized control, even in the name of equality, inherently incompatible with the nature of a free and complex society? The synthesis of Rand and Hayek. The synthesis of Rand's objectivism and Hayek's Austrian economics offers, therefore, a robust framework not only for criticizing the practical failures of socialism and material egalitarianism, but for attacking their moral and epistemological foundations. Rand provides the intransigent defense of the individual as the fundamental unit of value, whose right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness is absolute, and cannot be sacrificed for any collective or ideal of forced equality. Her ethic of rational egoism directly challenges the altruistic morality that demands the sacrifice of the capable to the incapable, of the successful to the needy, and that serves as a justification for coercive redistribution. She forces us to ask, by what right can some claim the fruits of the labor and mind of others? Hayek, in turn, provides the understanding of how individual liberty, operating within a system of private property and free markets, generates a complex and adaptive social order that coordinates the dispersed knowledge of millions in a way that no central planning could ever achieve. His analysis of the knowledge problem demonstrates the futility and inherent danger in attempts to control the economy and impose equal outcomes, showing that such efforts not only destroy prosperity, but also undermine the very freedom that makes civilization possible. He warns us against the fatal arrogance of believing that we can design society according to our desires, ignoring the spontaneous forces that govern it. Together, these perspectives form a powerful defense of the free society, based on respect for individual rights and an understanding of market processes. They argue that inequality of outcomes, within a just system of laws that protects freedom and property, is not a sign of system failure, but an inevitable consequence and even a driver of human diversity, innovation, and progress. The true injustice lies not in the inequality of honestly acquired wealth, but in the coercion used to level outcomes, violating rights and destroying incentives. The art of destroying socialists in 3 minutes lies not in empty slogans, but in the ability to articulate succinctly these fundamental principles: the moral primacy of the individual, Rand, and the practical impossibility and inherent danger of central planning in the face of dispersed knowledge, Hayek. It is to point out that the pursuit of forced material equality demands the violation of rights, a moral evil, and the destruction of the coordination mechanism that generates prosperity, a practical error. It is to challenge the premise that compassion requires coercion and to show that true social cooperation flourishes in freedom, the path to a freer society. The transformative conclusion that emerges from this profound analysis is not a simple call for the rejection of socialism or egalitarianism, but an invitation to a fundamental redefinition of our relationship with the concepts of freedom, justice, and progress. It means internalizing the understanding that individual liberty is not only a means to economic prosperity, but a moral imperative, an end in itself, rooted in the nature of the human being as a rational and volitional being. As Rand passionately argued, it implies accepting the complexity and uncertainty inherent in the human condition and the social order, recognizing, with Hayek, the limits of our own knowledge and the wisdom contained in the spontaneous processes and institutions that have evolved organically. The transformation lies in abandoning the pursuit of egalitarian utopias imposed from above, which invariably demand the sacrifice of liberty and the concentration of power, and embracing, instead, the ideal of a free society, where the relevant equality is equality before the law, and where each individual has the right to pursue his own goals and reap the fruits of his efforts, cooperating voluntarily with others. A practical path to redefining our relationship with the theme involves, firstly, A. Personal commitment to intellectual clarity and moral courage. It means studying and understanding the principles of individual liberty, private property, and the free market, not as dogmas, but as rational conclusions based on the observation of reality and history. It means daring to defend these principles in public discourse, even when unpopular, challenging the dominant narratives that demonize success, sanctify envy, and promote dependence on the state. Secondly, it implies focusing on value creation and voluntary cooperation as the true engines of human progress, in contrast to the zero-sum mentality and the politics of resentment that characterize egalitarianism. This can translate into supporting entrepreneurship, innovation, education focused on critical thinking and individual responsibility, and voluntary philanthropy as a genuine expression of compassion, as opposed to forced redistribution. Thirdly, it requires the vigilant defense of institutions that protect freedom and limit governmental power, strong constitutions, separation of powers, rule of law, secure property rights, and stable currency. It means opposing every new expansion of state control over the lives of individuals, even when justified by good intentions, always remembering Hayek's warning about the road to serfdom. The final transformation is a change of perspective, seeing human diversity and inequality of outcomes not as problems to be eliminated, but as reflections of freedom and sources of dynamism. It is to celebrate excellence, creativity, and individual success as benefits for all of society, and to focus collective efforts not on leveling outcomes, but on ensuring that everyone has the freedom and opportunity to develop their unique potential in an environment of peace and voluntary cooperation. The synthesis of Rand and Hayek does not offer an easy map to a perfect world, but provides the intellectual and moral tools to defend a world that is radically freer, more just, and more prosperous than any egalitarian utopia could ever be. The destruction of the socialist argument does not come from a rhetorical trick, but from the unwavering force of logic, ethics, and the understanding of reality that their philosophies, together, represent.